suppose you were in the hospital. Maybe you were facing surgery. Maybe you had the surgery. But the Christian came to visit with you. And somewhere during the conversation, they said, well, you know, my brother had what you've got, and he died from it. Now, such a person would be a poor excuse for a comforter. Job had a similar problem. As we saw last Sunday evening, Job was being tested. He didn't even know he was being tested. He didn't know what was going on. All of a sudden, he lost his wealth. His children were killed. He was afflicted from head to toe. Perhaps he had been forced to move to the ash heap. And not too long after this happens to him, he has 3 friends who come to comfort him. And they are sympathetic. And we're introduced to them in Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. When Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Job has endured all of his losses. He is now suffering from disease. The 3 friends hear of this. They come, and they do sympathize with him. They feel for what he's going through. They wept aloud because they saw how he was hurting. They showed the signs of grief as they tore their robes and put the dust on their heads. And for 7 days and nights, they just sat there with him. Didn't say a word. They realized how great his suffering was. Someone observed it could be that Job's 3 friends gave more comfort during their silence than they did during their speeches. You see, the 3 friends didn't give a great deal of comfort when they began to speak. They had their minds made up about the solution to Job's problems, what his problem was, and the solution to his problems. They said, okay, here's the case, Job. We know that the wicked people suffer. You're suffering. Therefore, you've sinned. And the remedy to your situation is for you to repent of those sins. Well, as Job says, I am not aware of any sin that I committed that would bring all this suffering about. In one of Job's replies to their speeches, he calls the 3 friends miserable comforters. Job chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. I have heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on arguing? I also could speak like you if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you. But my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. Yes, he calls them miserable comforters, comforters of trouble. In his suffering, Job had longed for sympathy. And he says, you know, I've heard many such things. I've heard all of this before. This is actually round 2 of the speeches when we get to this point. Nothing new is being said. Job is getting used to his friends by now and what they have to say, so he says, you know, I've heard this before. He reminds them that they originally came to comfort him, but they have failed to comfort him. Their windy words should end. Instead of sympathy, Job was given unfeeling moralizing and philosophizing. His friends made him Exhibit A in a philosophical discussion. Why do people suffer? Now, many people are searching for understanding. Too often they get a lecture from someone who hasn't even listened to their problems. All areas of society want understanding. Young people, sometimes they just want somebody to understand what they're going through. The elderly want understanding. Returning veterans need understanding. Yes, criminals need understanding. The sick certainly do. And those who are poor are looking for understanding. Now, of course, as we look at other people, as we consider ourselves, but as we look at other people, one thing we must never do is condone sin. But even if a person is suffering because of their sins, we should show sympathy to the sinner. You see, the sinner is lost. It could be that he has never heard how to receive forgiveness of his sins. But if you encounter someone who's lost, yes, they will go to hell unless they're saved from their sin. One thing we need to do is to reach out to people who are lost. And in the process of realizing their spiritual condition, we also need to deal with some immediate needs they're going through. And this can be different depending upon their background. For many years, we've had the scourge of AIDS. We don't hear quite as much about it as we used to. But there was a young man who became involved in homosexuality and then became infected with AIDS. There were those who knew him. Well, what would their response be to him? You got what you deserved? Or would it be understanding in dealing with the sickness, and in dealing with his sickness, open the door for evangelism so that he could be forgiven? You know, and especially in the early days of AIDS, you just didn't want to be around somebody that had it. You didn't want to risk being infected, even though it was very unlikely. There were Christians who reached out to those who had this terrible disease, a disease that they often had because of sin. But as they ministered to those individuals, they gave them comfort and often opened the door for evangelism. You know, Jesus opposed sin, but he spent time with sinners. And the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 12, verse 15, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." Do we seek to understand other people? When they're having something to celebrate, do we celebrate with them? And yes, when they're weeping, are we willing to weep with them? T. Curtis Clark said, "The touch of human hands, that is the boon we ask. For groping day by day along the way, we need the comrade heart that understands, and the warmth, the living warmth of human hands." Job needed understanding. He got lectures. Before we preach, we need to try to understand. Yes, Job had miserable comforters. They weren't doing him any good at all. And Job says, well, you know, I also could speak as you do. He basically says it doesn't take a wise man to do what you men are doing. He says you heap up words. You join words together. And they had some pretty long speeches. You could read them right there in the book of Job. They basically just kind of shake their heads. Now, Job says if the roles were reversed, I could do the same thing. Job would have been of the same mindset they were. Wicked people suffer. If you're suffering, you sin. But now he sees things differently. he's suffering, he knows that he is not a blatant sinner. And so he wonders, why am I suffering? But he says, you know, it takes no talent to attack people. Words are cheap when one doesn't understand. Now, a thief may flare up and may ask, well, have you ever been hungry? There are actually those who have stolen simply because they or their family were hungry. Well, it doesn't excuse sin, even if you're hungry. But it is a good question. Have you ever been hungry? And when we look at others, do we understand what they are experiencing? And are we working to solve their problems, or are we just condemning them? We're quick to criticize the problems of the other fellow. I think this was some years ago, but I read of a school teacher who criticized a pupil for not holding his paper in his right hand. On closer examination, he realized the student didn't have a right hand. We look at others, and when we look at others, we're much harder on them than we often are on ourselves. And we criticize rather than seeking to sympathize. Job said, I could strengthen you with my mouth, verse 5. He says it's easy to condemn. It's easy to say what you have. Perhaps partly the usual conceit that oneself can do better than others causes us to be critical. You know, I'd never get in that situation. I'd never be in that mess. That wouldn't happen to me. There have been people who had to eat those words because we can all get into situations we did not expect. As Job says this, he could have been being a bit sarcastic. Wouldn't blame him if he was. You know, I can strengthen you with my mouth. But Job is in a situation of suffering. He has these three friends who really aren't helping the situation at all. But when we suffer, it helps us to understand the suffering of others. Sympathy is born of suffering. There is in the experience of sorrow a power to help others which can be bought at no lesser cost. I was probably 10 or 11 years old. A young mother in the congregation died. It was totally unexpected. I mentioned that a week or two ago in a sermon. I was only 10 or 11 years old, but I could empathize with what her daughters were going through, because only a few years ago, before that, my mother had died. I don't know that I really had good words to offer. I sure knew where she was coming from, what she was facing. One who was paralyzed said, if I ever get out, in other words, if I ever get to the point that I can leave this facility, said, I'll call on people, for I know what it means. Visiting hospitals and nursing homes is not the easiest thing in the world. But I am so much happier to be the visitor than the visitee. There are times that a person can be in a nursing home and they seldom, if ever, have a visitor. They're just there. They're just forgotten. Sometimes it's even that case when one is in the hospital. When we suffer, I think it helps us to understand better. We can gain a new outlook. We can be more tender. We approach things differently. Someone said, before I brand a brother with envy or with shame. I'll whisper to my heart, he comes the road I came. If any sue for pity, though friend he be or foe, I'll whisper to my soul, he goes the road I go. Job has not only traveled the path, but he's traveled it well. He has suffered. He is beginning to understand what suffering is. Now, it is a false idea that much experience makes a sound advisor. Some people have a lot of bad experiences and don't learn a thing from it. A 5-time divorcee offered to write a book on how to keep a husband. I don't think she was qualified to write that book. She hadn't learned anything from her mistakes. But we do need to learn from experience, and we can learn from experience. A few years ago, I underwent a major surgery where they put me to sleep. That hadn't happened since I was about 5 or 6 years old, and they took my tonsils out. I gained a renewed understanding, or really an understanding of a little bit of what this is like to go through surgery. To go through facing the surgery, recovering from the surgery. We learn from our experience. And if we learn from it, we can help others. Now, suffering leaves some embittered and incapable of spiritual good. Remember Job's wife? She said, curse God and die. Now, that may have been a statement of pity, or it might have been an indication of her bitterness. And someone said, suffering makes one bitter or better. But what do we learn when we suffer? We ask the question, where can true comfort be found today? And the answer is in Jesus. We have an advantage Job didn't have. In comparison to Jesus, others are just miserable comforters. Confucius moralized, Buddha spiritualized, Socrates philosophized, none could sympathize. You see, none can carry the load for us as Jesus does. Jesus, though deity, lived as a man. He experienced problems, the problems we have. Now, Jesus could have condemned us. After all, he was sinless. Instead, Jesus invites, comforts, and strengthens. As the writer of Hebrews says, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Jesus has not only gone the way before, but he has gone successfully. Jesus says, as recorded in John chapter 16, I have overcome the world. Jesus faced what we face, and he faced it successfully. And we also do find comfort in Christ's people. One of the tasks, one of the opportunities of the Christian is to provide comfort for each other. And we need to try really hard not to be miserable comforters. What do we do when we encounter those who sin? Well, we need to offer help rather than judgment. What do we do when we encounter those who had death? People say some really stupid things when they encounter someone who's lost a loved one. It was for the best. God needed her more than you. It was God's will. I know how you feel. Quite often, when we encounter someone who's lost a loved one, we would do well to be quiet and sit with them, as the comforters did at first. But there are those of us who have gone through the death of loved ones. We do know what it is to lose a parent. Some sadly know what it is for a child to die. Most of us have experienced the death of siblings. One experience that most of us have only once in life is the death of a spouse. And there is no one out there whose spouse is still living who can offer adequate comfort because they don't understand. But we can be there. We can listen. We can sympathize. We can offer comfort to those who are sick. Perhaps one thing we need to be cautious in saying is, well, you know, I had that same surgery and it took me months to recover. Let's try to put a positive spin on it. Be realistic, be positive. We do say, yes, the surgery you're undergoing, I've had that surgery, I've had something similar. There are going to be some challenges, but you can make it. I did. When my dad had his first angioplasty, I knew what he was going through. Unfortunately, I started much younger in life having my angioplasties. I'd been there before. And we've all known individuals who've gone through different health situations. And they gained help from talking to people who've gone through the same thing. Yes, sometimes it's hard to find words of comfort. But we can always be there for the person. We can pray for the person and pray with the person. And we can point that person to Jesus for comfort. We really need to ask the question of ourselves, what kind of comforter am I? And we want to avoid the situation we read about in the book of Job, where he said to his friends, you are a miserable comforter.